President Harris on Friday at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. She was there to talk about the space program in general and to speak with some astronauts on the International Space Station. I began by asking the Vice President about how over 2 decades our focus has had to shift from foreign terror to the threat from within.
I think it is very dangerous, and I think it is very harmful, and it makes us weaker. You know, I have met with, and I've had conversations with over 100 foreign heads of state, presidents, prime ministers, chancellors, kings. And, you know, when we as the United States walk into those rooms around the world, we have had the honor and privilege historically of holding our head up as a defender and an example of a great democracy. And that then gives us the legitimacy and the standing to talk about the importance of democratic principles, rule of law, human rights. And one of the things, though, that comes with that privilege is that we hold ourselves out to be a role model, which means the rest of the world, like any role model, watches what we do to see if it matches up with what we say. So you look at everything from the fact that there are 11 people right now running for Secretary of State, the keepers of the integrity of the voting system of their state, who are election deniers. You've got...
And what's that sending? What message does that send to the world?
Well, you couple that with people who hold some of the highest elected offices in our country who refuse to condemn an insurrection on January 6th. And I think what it sends is a signal that causes people to question, hey, is America still valuing what they talk about, which is the integrity of democracies, which means protecting rule of law and the sanctity of these systems and speaking up when they are attacked. And I'm very concerned about it, Chuck. I'll tell you, I'm very concerned about it because there are so many issues going on in the world that I think require at least how we as Americans have traditionally thought about what is right, what is good, what should be fought for, what should be human ideals, and certainly the ideals of democracies. And I think that through the process of what we've been through, we're starting to allow people to call into question our commitment to those principles. And that's a shame.
Nearly 70% of Republicans don't believe that the president and yourself won the 2020 election legitimately. Do you think you'll ever be able to change their minds?
I find that polling interesting, and I'm going to tell you why. I'm traveling the country. We're here in Houston. I was in, North Carolina. I've been traveling all over the country. I don't find that. I don't get that kind of sense or feedback.
Do you think you talk to a lot of Republicans?
I think I talk to a lot of Americans,
okay.
And I'll tell you, when I talk to folks and they know that, for example, there was a bipartisan infrastructure law that, in Durham is going to fix I-40, or here in Houston is going to fix Telephone Road, those are some of their priorities. When I talk to people about what we're doing, that we're going to make sure, especially after the pandemic, that all families, all working families have access to affordable high-speed internet, and we're going to bring the cost of it down, less $30 a month, plus people are going to get a $100 voucher to buy a laptop or an iPad. People want to hear that. Look what happened in Kansas on the issue of choice. People whoever they voted for in the last election or in the next, stood up and said it is not right that we take a constitutional right from the women of America and deprive them of the ability to make decisions about their own body, and instead say the government's in a better position to do that.
You say you take issue with this idea that there are 70%. Do you think there's
I just don't experience that.
You don't experience it? You don't know if they exist?
I think that...
Or do you think they just say it?
I would not dare tell anyone what they should think. I'm just telling you that I do believe that when it comes down to the things that wake people up in the middle of the night, that worry them about their future, about their family, about their children or their parents, most of those issues they think of not through the lens of the party with which they're registered to vote.
What is a semi-fascist?
Listen, I think that let's not get caught up in politicizing the fact that most people in America know that it is not helpful to our country when we have people who are denying elections or trying to obstruct the outcome of an election where the largest number of people in our country voted for the President of the United States. And when we look at where we are,